Number 10. Distant galaxy signals. Here is an extremely new signal reported by the BBC in January of 2019. According to their news report, astronomers detected mysterious signals from a distant galaxy. These mysterious signals were picked up in Canada by a super strong telescope. But the problem is, nobody knows the origin or the nature of these mysterious radio wave blasts. There were exactly 13 quick radial bursts, known in the industry as FRBs, or fast radio bursts, and each burst was coming from the exact same source. How far away was this source? It was roughly 1.5 billion light years away from Earth. This is one of those events that only happens once in a blue moon. In fact, this exact type of incident has only happened one previous time, captured by another telescope. This group of bursts was captured at the Chime Observatory in British Columbia. The observatory consists of 4 enormous semi-cylindrical antennas that constantly scan the northern sky in an endless effort to detect alien signals. Interestingly enough, the telescope only began running in 2018. Almost immediately upon the system being activated, they detected the 13 FRBs. Since then, the interesting and incredibly mysterious radio waves have been published in the journal Nature. Nobody knows who, what, or where they came from, and we may never know. Number 9. The strong signal. Here's a signal from May of 2015, and unlike many signals that come from deep space millions of light years away, this signal actually comes from a relatively close cluster of stars. Supposedly, the signal was described by astronomers and scientists as being a very strong signal, quote unquote, and it appears to have been sent from a star inside a nearby constellation. The constellation is known as Hercules, and the star is known as HD 164595. The most interesting aspect of the star is that it only sits about 95 light years away. In theory, a human could travel that far in their lifetime if they were sent into space as a baby. Even more interesting is that according to the article posted by The Independent, the star is almost the exact size as our planet. There's also a small planet within close proximity of the star, roughly the same size as Neptune, which has a 40-day year and may hold the potential for growing life. While not provable, there is a theory that says this signal could have come from a sudden burst of technology on the planet, such as a powerful harnessing of energy from the star. It would place this civilization as Type 2, meaning they are more advanced than the human race. Number 8. Gamma ray burst. You may be familiar with gamma rays as the source of the Incredible Hulk's green strength, but gamma ray radiation is actually very real, and there's a lot of it swirling around in space. According to the BBC, researchers in 2012 discovered evidence that Earth had been struck by a mega blast of gamma radiation sometime in the Middle Ages. Nobody can quite figure out for sure what would have caused such a burst of radiation to be hurled through space, but a new study is saying that it could have been the result of 2 black holes merging together somewhere in our galaxy. Such a devastating force would have hurled huge amounts of energy at our planet. A burst of gamma radiation hitting the planet may sound pretty scary, and that's because it is. While scientists believe this particular burst occurred roughly 12,000 light years away, if one had happened closer, it could have destroyed the entire ozone layer and devastated life on Earth as we know it. Even more disturbing is that if it had happened in modern times and not medieval times, it very likely would have taken down every single satellite. That means no more internet, and no more of these great videos. A very scary thought indeed. Number 7. Superluminous supernova. Supernovas are relatively common. A supernova is what happens when a star collapses, and the energy from the implosion can be seen even from Earth, with the light reaching us just like a blaring radio signal. These events have already taken place billions of years ago, as most supernovas travel to us at a distance of several billion light years away. Scientists have documented many supernovas. Recently, the biggest superluminous supernova ever was discovered. This intense burst of light was named ASA SSN-15LH, and it happened roughly 3.8 billion light years away from us. That means it happened almost 4 billion years ago, and the light's only reaching us just now. To give you an idea of how bright this event was, it was roughly 570 billion times brighter than the sun. I don't think there are any sunglasses on Earth that could withstand that kind of brightness. That is one scary transmission. Number 6. The WOW signal. The WOW signal is undoubtedly the most famous transmission ever received on our planet. It happened on August 15, 1977. It was at The Ohio State University, and the signal was captured on their Big Ear radio telescope. The telescope at the time was being used to search for any possible evidence of extraterrestrial life. Ordinarily, those researching the printout of extraterrestrial signals saw nothing but random 1s and 2s, with a few 4s and 3s mixed in, all mostly from random space activity. But the WOW signal consisted of 6EQUJ5. What the signal means is anyone's guess. It happened only once, and it went on for an entire 72 seconds. The researcher was so impressed by the signal and so shocked when he discovered it that he circled it and wrote "Wow!" next to it, hence the name. There are a lot of theories as to where the signal could have possibly come from, but there's nothing conclusive. The only thing researchers know is that the signal seems to have come from the constellation Sagittarius, and that it looks exactly like what an extraterrestrial signal would look like. Could it have been a passing craft? Could it have been a sudden burst of information from a distant civilization? Well, we will probably never know. Number 5. Jupiter's bow shock. In 2016, the Juno spacecraft entered Jupiter's magnetosphere, and what they captured on audio was incredible. They picked up outstanding audio signals as they crossed the planet's bow shock. The bow shock is the point in which the solar wind meets Jupiter's magnetosphere. The solar wind is an emission from the sun, essentially supersonic solar wind that blows past planets at roughly 1 million miles an hour. The magnetosphere is the protective field around Jupiter, and it acts like a barrier, just like how our own magnetosphere pushes back the intense radiation of the sun. So, as the Juno spacecraft crossed this breach, a sound like a sonic boom was emitted into the spacecraft and picked up on audio. This was an invisible signal about 2 hours long, but NASA released a compressed clip only a few seconds in length, and it is incredibly creepy. It's the sound of space, and it will give you some freaky chills. Number 4. Screams from Ganymede. Alright, there's a lot of science to unpack in this one. The short version is that chorus waves are electromagnetic waves around planets and moons that can be easily converted into sound. They're a type of plasma wave occurring at super low frequencies that can not only be captured on audio, but also seen visibly by the naked eye. The northern lights on Earth are a direct result from our chorus waves, and when chorus waves on Earth are converted into sound, they sound quiet and peaceful and something like a choir of singing angels or chirping birds. However, a report in Nature Communications in 2018 claims that astronomers were extremely surprised to be listening to the audio recording from Jupiter's largest moon, Ganymede, as the sound was absolutely horrifying. The chorus waves were converted into sound, and the sound clip is not pleasant at all. Rather than the sound of chirping birds or pretty singing, the chorus waves around Jupiter's huge moon sound like people screaming in horrible agony or one of those death whistles. It is a rough thing to listen to, and sounds like something straight out of your nightmares. Number 3. FRB 121102. Fast radio bursts have been getting more and more popular lately, from the WOW signal to the mysterious repeating signal that was sent every 16 days from somewhere deep in space. But there are other creepy signals being sent from outer space that scientists simply can't explain right now. One of them is FRB 121102. This is the only FRB that has repeated itself more than once. It's like a hiccup that has flashed over 150 times from the exact same source. According to SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the source is exactly 3 billion light-years away, resting at the edge of a small galaxy. Keep in mind that whatever caused the radio burst happened 3 billion years ago, but it's only now reaching the Earth in the form of radio signals. The big question is, what caused the burst in the first place? And why is it repeating so persistently? At the time of the first transmission, life on Earth would have still been in the ocean, and not even close to having evolved yet. And yet, 3 billion years ago, something sent a signal more powerful than all the energy discharged by the sun in a full year, and let it all out in a blink of an eye. Even more interesting is that the galaxy from which the signal originated is dozens of times smaller than our own. Galactic war? Or an expanding black hole exploding? We'll probably never know. Number 2, 157-day signal. This is by far the most remote signal being sent to Earth on a regular basis. There have been bursts from galaxies 1.5 billion light-years away, and even as close as 500 million light-years away. But this weird repeating signal is being sent from a dwarf galaxy roughly 3 billion light-years away from us. According to a report by CBS News, astronomers announced in 2019 that they had detected a mysterious FRB repeating every 157 days. This is only the second time in history that an FRB has repeated such a pattern. Apparently, there is a 90-day window in which FRBs are received by Earth, then 67 days of total silence. The loop repeats every 157 days without fail. While first discovered in 2012, the whole pattern was not identified until just recently. But what could it possibly mean? As a general rule, space is not concise, nor does it repeat. Could it be an SOS signal repeating from somewhere deep in space? Or is it just a freak radio signal from a dying star? Number 1, the 16-day signal. 2020 was an incredible year for the human race. The first modern pandemic crippled the world, and in February of 2020, something scientists are referring to as the first reliable pattern of any transmitted signal from deep space was discovered. In an early report by The Sun, the newspaper, it appears that a mysterious and unidentified object roughly 500 million light-years away is baffling scientists. This unnamed object appears to have been transmitting the same signal every 16 days. Because of their consistency, many scientists believe there is something intelligent controlling the signals. To put this intense new discovery into perspective, there have only been about 100 types of fast radio bursts ever found. Out of those 100, only 10 were repeats, meaning that they happened more than once. However, this marks the very first consistent signal that appears to have a rhythm and a purpose. The signal was discovered by the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment in British Columbia. This is the second major signal discovered by the Canadians. But here's where it gets crazy. The first signal they detected that appeared to have possible sentient connection was 1.5 billion light-years away, but this newest signal is only 500 million light-years away. Could this mean whatever is transmitting the signal is getting closer to Earth? At a rate of 500 million light-years per year, that would place them on our doorstep in late winter of 2021. Number 11. Blackbeard. The mysterious Edward Teach is better known by his other name, Blackbeard the Pirate. We know more about Blackbeard's terrible adventures than we do about the man behind the excessive facial hair. He actually made full use of his beard, reportedly burning fuses in it, so he smelled like something from hell itself. Like any pirate worth their sea salt, Blackbeard buried the treasure he plundered. He had a brief career in piracy between 1716 and 1718, even giving it up for a while after surrendering in exchange for a pardon. However, it was only a matter of time before his number came up. He ruthlessly abandoned his men so he could keep as much of the booty for himself. But where, ultimately, did he squirrel away his stash? Truth is, no one really knows. Blackbeard roamed both the American coast and the Caribbean, so a lot of places spring to mind. Former vessel the Queen Anne's Revenge is one idea, though the wreck is still being explored. In a twist, the excavation is the subject of legal proceedings, to be decided this year. Other possible locations include Plum Point in North Carolina, where he tried to settle down following his pardon. There's even a story that the devil took it. Number 10. Dutch Schultz. We usually associate treasure with pirates, but gangsters bury it also. Before he was killed by rivals in 1935, the infamous Dutch Schultz is thought to have hidden a $7 million stash in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. It isn't known whether the treasure is actually there, or if it's just a tall tale. Nearly a century after his violent demise, people are still out there looking for it. The millions are said to be in a steel box, which was buried on the banks of Esopus Creek, an epic tributary of the Hudson River. How do we know this? Because in the hamlet of Phoenicia, it's reported that men in fedora hats were seen carrying shovels. What were those guys doing? Attending a shovel convention? Unlikely. Another key factor is that Schultz, real name Arthur Flegenheimer, mentioned the treasure himself, though he should say that was on his deathbed, and he maybe wasn't making a whole amount of sense at the time. It was the inevitable violent end to a career in bootlegging and illegal gambling that led to various turf wars. Schultz sleeps with the fishes, but his treasure lying in the mud? Time will tell. And now number 9, but first, be sure to subscribe and let us know which treasure you would want to look for in the comments below. Number 9, Jesse James. Now, this is an interesting one. The Wild West outlaw Jesse James buried gold bullion to collect later on, but he hid the bounty in various locations. While some of the bullion has actually been found, some of it hasn't, so it's both found and not found. That said, the story behind the gold is fascinating. It came from a Mexican government transport that was robbed by the James Gang in 1876. Said to be worth approximately $2 million, the bullion was then buried in the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma. A network of different sites, combined with maps and things like clues carved into rocks, made the treasure super difficult to find. There's been talk for years over where the gold lies. Jesse himself died in 1882, but then his brother Frank suddenly moved to Oklahoma from Missouri in 1907. He was supposedly farming peaches, but clearly had something else on his mind, asking around about certain places. Eventually, he went back home. Years later, lawman Joe Hunter received a series of maps from an old associate of his father's. This led him finding some of the bullion at a location called Buzzard's Roost. He also dug up a bucket at Tarbone Mountain. Why a bucket? Well, that's what the James Gang used for their contract, carving T's and C's into the brass. Sounds like the ultimate bucket list, am I right? Number 8, John S. Mosby. John S. Mosby was a clever and dangerous man from Virginia. Serving for the Confederates during the Civil War, his famous nickname was the Gray Ghost. Well, it was because of his skills as a raider, where he and the men he commanded would swoop in and out at night. He was so good at that the group were called Mosby's Rangers. In 1863, the Rangers were in Union territory. To be more precise, the vicinity of the Fairfax County Courthouse. They were there to capture General Edwin H. Stoughton, which they did with their usual style. The operation ran quite smoothly, but there was one factor that didn't go to plan. Stoughton had a bag full of gold, silver, jewelry, and more, which was the property of the South. Mosby took the bag with him, but was forced to bury it when it looked like Union men were closing in to attack. There, the treasure lies to this day. It's believed to be worth around $6 million and is apparently buried between 2 pine trees near the courthouse. At least Mosby got something out of the raid, receiving a promotion to captain for his daring efforts. Number 7, Lufthansa heist. At the end of 1978, a major robbery took place that went down in history as the biggest heist of its kind on U.S. soil. The target was the Lufthansa cargo building, part of JFK Airport in New York. This attention-grabbing crime was carried out by the Lucchesi crime family. Waiting for them in the vault was around $5 million in cash, and jewelry to the value of $875,000. If you think that story might sound familiar, you'd be right. The Lufthansa heist was dramatized in Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, where Robert De Niro and Ray Liotta portrayed fictionalized versions of the main players. De Niro's James Conway, inspired by Jimmy the Gent Burke, chillingly plotted to whack the thieves so he could keep most of the money for himself, not dissimilar to the behavior of Blackbeard. After this, the loot was hidden and no one really knows what happened to it or where it is. The FBI spent decades tailing mob captain Vincent Asaro, thought to be heavily involved in the heist. And while they got him into court a few years back, they couldn't make anything stick. This unique case of American treasure may never be cracked. Number 6, the Fenn treasure. Millionaire author and art collector Forrest Fenn was diagnosed with cancer and vowed to hide a treasure chest containing some of his most valuable possessions sometime before he died. In 2010, he buried an antique lockbox full of goodies somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. The treasure is rumored to be worth around $3 million, but nobody knows what its contents truly consist of. It's said to contain an assortment of jewels, rare objects, and many gold items, including coins, nuggets, ornaments, and jewelry. Fenn hopes that its discovery will bring excitement and fun to people, and he hopes that search inspires people to enjoy and explore nature. He wrote a memoir called The Thrill of the Chase, and a 24-line poem meant to lead treasure seekers to its location. He says the poem holds 9 clues that will lead people to the treasure. As of this year, around 350,000 people have searched, but nobody's found it yet. In June of 2019, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office in Montana reminded the public to use extreme caution when looking for the treasure. Several people have died on their quest. Several have been rescued from near death, and others have had run-ins with law enforcement. Sheriffs have asked Fenn to please call off the hunt, since they spend hundreds of volunteer hours rescuing people looking for the treasure. But while Fenn is sorry for those people, he says practically all of the correspondence he gets is from people wanting it to continue. Fenn briefly considered calling off the search after treasure hunter Paris Wallace's death in 2017, but he ultimately decided not to. Number 5. Old Ozark Cave. In Sulphur Springs, northwest Arkansas, there's a cave called the Old Spanish Treasure Cave. This rocky region is part of the Ozark Mountains that covers several states. The springs are located along the Missouri-Arkansas border, and according to legend, Spanish conquistadors buried a plundered fortune there. When the conquistadors, or conquerors, rocked up on American shores, they wasted no time taking stuff that didn't belong to them. The Aztecs, Mayans, and Native Americans were all subject to violence and theft. It didn't end well for the unwanted Spanish visitors, who were pursued and almost wiped out around 300 years ago. The treasure was buried in an old cave before the owners could get their hands on it. Those who survived left clues for those wanting to find the ill-gotten goodies later. Stuff like carvings and, of course, maps. This area is known for its stories about fabulous treasures, such as gold and silver mines. Another person thought to have buried treasure here was none other than Jesse James. Bits and pieces have been found, but so far nothing to suggest the presence of a mighty hoard. Number 4. Palomano Point. Palomano Point is found off the Big Island, aka Hawaii, and is reckoned to hold many secret treasures beneath the waves. For starters, there's plunder aplenty, courtesy of 16th century pirate Captain Thomas Cavendish. That name sounds pretty swanky for a pirate, and it was. Cavendish was a wealthy Englishman who did that kind of thing for a laugh, it sounds. Like many a pirate, he didn't play by the rules. He left to raid Spanish ships during England's war with the Armada. Cavendish set sail with 3 ships under his command and ruthlessly sank ones so he could concentrate his plundering efforts with the other 2. He was a big fan of Sir Francis Drake, and went on to beat Drake's circumnavigation of the globe record by a whole 9 months. He was called the Navigator because of his planet-circling prowess, and received knighthood from Elizabeth I. It's rumored a fortune of Cavendish's worth, in excess of $5 million, is under the water there. How did it get there? Well, Palomano Point is believed to have played host to shipwrecks, some of which predate the arrival of Captain Cook and the influence of Europeans on Hawaii. Experts dispute this, but nevertheless, treasure hunters are determined to bag that booty. Number 3. Shawnee Silver Mines. It's known that the Shawnee Indians used silver to make stuff like amulets, but where did they get this silver from hundreds of years ago? Was there a hoard of silver treasure somewhere, or were the Shawnee more industrious? Various stories claim they were mining their own metal and using furnaces to smelt it down. Proving this idea, and indeed finding evidence, is a tricky business for a couple of reasons. When prisoners were taken, such as the explorer Daniel Boone, they were reportedly set to work in these mines. Thought to be located in Ohio, the location was top secret, and captives had to wear a blindfold so no one quite knew where they were. On their release, all they could say was that they were near a village called Chillicothe. Trouble is, there's more than one Chillicothe. Other silver mines were talked about in Kentucky by English sailor John Swift. He got his hands on the precious silver, but then fell foul of the political situation back in England. Swift was imprisoned and sadly lost most of his sight behind bars. Journals were written and maps were drawn up. However, without his eyes to guide him, the facts couldn't be established. How frustrating. Number 2. Ted Binion Silver. When talented gaming exec Ted Binion died in 1998, at the relatively young age of 55, the story made headlines. Binion's father Benny was well known on the Las Vegas casino circuit, and Ted appeared to live the life of a movie character, taking drugs and getting in with gangsters and politicians. His demise was pretty dramatic, and what's more, it points to some buried treasure. Initially, it looked like Binion committed suicide, but then girlfriend Sandy Murphy and Rick Tabish were put on trial accused of murder. It was believed they wanted to get a hold of Binion's multi-million-dollar silver collection, which was located in an underground vault in the Nevada town of Pahrump. Murphy and Tabish were sent down, but the decision was later overturned. They were then convicted over trying to steal the fortune. So all Binion's treasure had been accounted for, right? Wrong! A significant amount is reportedly secreted on his property, still to be discovered. Number 1. Thomas Beale ciphers. Thomas J. Beale has a lot to answer for. He was supposedly acting on behalf of adventurers from Virginia, who entrusted him their riches. Beale hid the treasures for them in Bedford County. Who were these adventurers? No one knows. Where in the county did he hide the loot? No one knows, but it is known what the treasure looks like. How come? It's all thanks to Beale's ciphers. He drew up 3 encrypted documents in the 1820s explaining everything, but so far, only one has been cracked. This relates to what the treasure looks like once you get your hands on it. It comprises nearly 3,000 pounds of gold, just over 5,000 pounds of silver, and assorted jewels. With a collected value of around $40 million, it's buried in a vault 6 feet underground. Beale himself vanished from the scene, leaving his ciphers to tantalize and baffle the world. He certainly set a challenge for the ages. To this day, the documents are still being pored over, with people none the wiser as to what he had in mind. On top of that, some believe the whole deal is a hoax. Still, it's gotta be worth a try. Number 10. Orlando Sorrell. Here's a rather surprising story about a young boy who had some real sense knocked into him. Literally. This happened back in 1979 when Orlando Sorrell was playing baseball. Everything was going fine until a ball smacked him right in the side of his head. Of course, he had not been wearing a helmet, so the ball did some serious damage to the left side of his noggin. And even though he got up moments later and continued to play ball, something had already happened inside of his mind. After complaining about headaches for quite some time, they eventually cleared. And when they did clear, Orlando realized he had shocking new abilities. Orlando was able to perform the most complex calendar calculations ever. He was able to remember the weather from every single day that had passed since the day of his incident. At the time, Orlando quickly became a media sensation. Since then, he's even allowed medical professionals to study him in an attempt to determine how a baseball to the head gave him such unprecedented powers. But we gotta warn you, this is not an experiment you want to recreate in your spare time. You're bound to wind up with nothing more than a headache. Number 9. Franco Magnani. Let us introduce you to a fascinating individual. Mr. Franco Magnani was an Italian immigrant living in San Francisco back in the 1960s. Up until the 60s, he'd been a perfectly normal person with nothing wrong and no particular skills when it came to photorealism or memory. He was just an average guy. But then, a strange disease struck Franco and he became terribly ill. Serious symptoms like a fever and delirium, the kind of sickness that people often used to perish from, or at least go mad because of. And in his delirious dream states, Franco dreamed of his home from childhood, back in Pontito, Italy, which he had not seen for at least a decade. When Franco finally woke from his terrifying delirium, he would paint the dreams he had seen, and as it turned out, the pictures were perfect snapshots of the village in which he'd grown up. It seems that somehow the fever had unlocked photorealistic imagery from somewhere deep in his brain, and he could now recall exact pictures of things he had seen from childhood. Basically, the fever gave this man the incredible gift to paint perfectly real photographs. And now for number 8. But first, let us know what superpower you wish you could get in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you're new here. Number 8. Jim Carollo. Here we have a man whose entire life changed at the age of 14 when he was the victim of a terrifying car accident. In the car accident, Jim's mother was killed, and he himself fell into a deep coma. The car accident resulted in extensive brain injuries, and he was injured to such a shocking degree that the doctors never thought he would live for more than a few weeks. However, against all the odds stacked against him, Jim did survive. He went through rigorous physical rehabilitation and returned to school, and that was when he realized that he had a gift. Before the car accident, he had literal zero interest in math, but then afterwards, math just kind of flowed out of his brain. He managed to ace all of his geometry tests in high school, then skipped straight to calculus, passing each exam easily. Jim was able to remember every single number in every solution like it was nothing. It took him only a single day to memorize 200 digits of pi. Talk about an accident jangling loose some math skills. After his brutal car accident, Jim became a certified math wizard. There is not a math question on earth that Jim can't answer in a split second. Number 7. Tony Cicoria. Tony Cicoria was 42 years old, a former college player and well-respected orthopedic surgeon in upstate New York back in 1994. In that same year, he was at a family gathering on a lazy afternoon. It was pleasant, there were a few clouds in the distance, and it looked like it might rain. Tommy went to make a phone call at a nearby payphone. He phoned his mother. His mother hung up. He was in the process of hanging up the phone himself, and a flash of lightning rocketed out of the phone and hit him straight in the face. According to Tommy himself, the next thing he knew, he was flying backwards. This amazing story was in a very real report by the New Yorker. Tony claims that after he was struck by lightning, he could see his own body on the ground. He thought he was dead. He said he had the perception of going extremely fast and being drawn upward right before he was slammed back into his body. But the craziest part of the story is what happened after, when Tony had an insatiable desire to not only listen to piano music, but to play for himself. Tony had preferred rock and roll before, but ever since he was struck by lightning, he had an undeniable compulsion to play and listen to piano music. He even went so far as to hear music in his head. Tony went from knowing nothing about the piano to being a relatively skilled piano player, all because of a shock of lightning through a telephone. Number 6. Derek Amato. This story is relatively new. In fact, it's pretty similar to the story of Tony, but with a bit of a twist. In 2006, Derek Amato had been living in Denver, Colorado. One day, for whatever reason, Derek decided to dive into a pool. Well, the pool was a bit too shallow and he clanked his head on the bottom. He blacked out and woke up in the hospital. Because of his hard hit on the bottom of the pool, Derek was left with massive hearing loss, brutal headaches, and persisting memory problems. The accident also left Derek a musical prodigy. He'd never been musically inclined until after the accident. He then began to see in his mind a continuous stream of music notes. Without even trying, he had the ability to sit at a piano and play complex pieces of music that most professionals took years to master. Nobody understands how this could be possible, but there's no denying that it's true. Number 5. Tommy McHugh. This is one of the most shocking turn of events that we've ever come across. Tommy McHugh never cared for art in his life. He had no interest in paintings, he had no interest in poetry, and he had no interest in any kind of artistic expression at all. In fact, Tommy, who comes from the United Kingdom, was something of a troubled youth. He lived much of his life in the ordinary fashion that most people do. But then an accident on the toilet would totally flip his life around and reinvent his purpose on Earth. Tommy'd been sitting on the toilet when he claims that he felt an explosion on the left side of his head. Tommy then ended up on the floor, and according to Tommy himself, was kept awake only by the fact that he did not want to be found with his pants down. However, Tommy claims the other side of his head exploded violently, or so it seemed, and the next thing he knew, he was waking up in the hospital. From then on, Tommy discovered an almost obsessive interest in art and poetry. He soon discovered that it was all he wanted to do: paint and write. The real kicker was that he could do it almost perfectly. He turned out to be an amazing painter and a fantastic poet, and it was all because his brain nearly short-circuited when he was sitting on the toilet. Number 4. Liam Hoekstra. Meet the boy who will make you ashamed of your current body shape. Liam Hoekstra, at only 11 years old, had the body of an Olympic athlete. This kid had legitimate super strength. He had bigger muscles than most grown boxers. However, this young boy's super strength came from a genetic condition that caused a suppression of the gene that was supposed to produce the kid's myostatin. In a normal person's body, this gene suppresses the growth of muscles. This is so that people's hearts don't grow too large and cause them to die. However, this boy didn't have that gene, so he was endowed with 40% more muscle mass than the average person. Number 3. John Sarkin. Here we have yet another story of a man who suffered a terrible brain injury, only to be gifted incredible powers. According to a report by The Guardian, John Sarkin had been practicing as a chiropractor, 35 years old and perfectly healthy, when he suffered an enormous stroke. It came on suddenly and devastated John's mind. But after he recovered, John found that he had manifested an intense need to create. Perhaps this was because his brain needed to make sense of what was going on around him, we can't say. But the fact remains that after he recovered from his brain trauma, he became an intensely talented painter and went on to create phenomenal works of art. Number 2. Javier Botet. Meet one of Hollywood's only real-life superpowered humans. His name is Javier Botet, and he hails from just north of Madrid in Spain. You may recognize this Spaniard from such movies as Mama and Slender Man, and even had a cameo in Game of Thrones. Javier Botet is one of the most popular creature actors in the business, but it's not just because of his love of cinema or an inherent skill in acting. No, Javier is extremely popular in the horror subgenre because he's 6 feet 6 inches tall and he was born with something called Marfan syndrome, which makes people very tall, very skinny, and extremely flexible. While not an accident exactly, we highly doubt anyone chooses to be born with such a genetic condition. It is lucky that Javier found something that he can do with his condition that he loves. According to a report by the BBC, he's able to do extremely strange things with his limbs and fingers, since everything on his body is longer than average and can move in extremely unusual ways. He's probably the closest thing that we have on Earth to a real elastic man. Number 1. Jason Padgett. There appears to be no shortage these days of people who had accidents and then turned into math geniuses. However, Jason Padgett is a little different than all the rest. The man, who's originally from Alaska but has been living in Washington state, was not born with a love for math. He, like all the other overnight math geniuses, had a horrible accident. While out with his friends one night, Jason was attacked, beaten horribly, and robbed by 2 men just outside of a karaoke bar, which happened in September of 2002. The attack gave Jason a traumatic brain injury, which ended up giving him obsessive-compulsive disorder. Jason became obsessed with pixelation and began drawing incredibly complicated mathematical designs, sketches of circles and triangles overlapping in incredibly complex ways. His injury had allowed him to understand and draw the most complicated geometric shapes known to man. Thanks to his bizarre talent, Jason took a liking to math. He was discovered by a physicist while walking in a mall, and Jason soon enrolled in college and was on his way to being an aspiring number theorist. Being kicked in the head truly unlocked something wonderful in his mind. Which of these superpowers are you most envious of? Let us know in the comments below, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video. Thanks for watching this episode. Did you like the video? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and be sure to like, follow, and subscribe.